Well, we're retelling the old stories. So we started with Adam and Eve, and we told the story of the garden and how they disobeyed. The thing that I keep noticing as I keep going back to these stories that I learned as a kid growing up in church, the thing that I keep seeing is not so much a story about the people that are involved and the characters there, but a story about the God who is faithful throughout. So you have Adam and Eve, and they disobey, even though God created them and gave them this perfect, amazing paradise, and walked with them and talked with them, and they experienced the fullness of relationship with Him. But they still, like you and me, they disobeyed. And when they did, God continued to be faithful to them. Yeah, they were punished and they were banished from perfection. They no longer got to live forever in that way, but God did not abandon them when they left the garden. His faithfulness continued through their children and their children's children. Well, and then last week we talked about Noah, and if you remember, what happened is after they left the garden, things definitely started to get out of control. Sin started to get worse, violence grew, and we got to a point where God looked at His world and He was just, it says, grieved with sadness towards what He had created. So He brings this flood to destroy it all. But again, the faithfulness of God continues because He doesn't completely destroy it. He finds this one guy and his family that He will begin anew with, Noah. And after the flood, Noah comes out, and from him and his family will come a restart, a renewal of the world. And yet, the first story we see is a reminder of the sinfulness that even in Noah is found. And if you remember, he gets drunk and passes out naked in a tent. And his sons, one who is disrespectful and is then cursed by Noah, two who come and who cover him, and Noah blesses. But through all of this, we see God's faithfulness. Even after the flood, God says to Noah, you're going to see this rainbow in the sky, and it's going to be a sign of my covenant with you. And here's what I'm going to promise you. I'm not going to destroy the world like this. Even though sin is at the heart of every one of my creation, I'm not going to destroy it again like this. Well, that's the first half of Genesis, is that story. And it leads as, again, after the flood, it starts spiraling down again. Sin starts getting more and more rampant to another point where God goes from working in all of creation to choosing redemption through one family. And the second half of Genesis shows us the story of that family. I want to give you a little bit of an intro to what that looks like. And we're going to look at some of the characters of this family today and in the next couple weeks. So check this out.
We're walking through the book of Genesis, which is made up of these two main parts.
And the first part begins in the garden, where we watch humanity spiral downward in self-destruction, and it ends in the Tower of Babel, where a rebellious humanity is scattered by God.
Then the second part of Genesis zooms in and focuses on just one family.
And right in the middle is this story that links the two parts of Genesis together and helps us understand what the whole book is all about.
So how do we get from the Tower of Babel to this story here in the middle?
Well, after the scattering at Babel, there's this genealogy, and it follows one of the tribes all the way down to this one guy named Abram.
You probably know him as Abraham.
And God starts making all these promises to Abraham, like He's going to bless him and give him a ton of kids. And He says that through him and his family, all the nations of the earth are now going to find God's blessing. So basically, God is trying to restore humanity back to the goodness of the garden and to His original intentions for the world. So it's like His rescue plan for humanity. And that's why the whole second half of Genesis is about this one family. And so you have Abraham, and then he has his son Isaac, who has Jacob, and then Jacob has 12 sons. And to each generation, God renews His promise to bless them and all nations through them.
So because of this promise to use this family to rescue the world, it's pretty easy to read these stories as examples of how to be a good person.
But actually, for the most part, this family is totally dysfunctional. So for example, let's go back to Abraham. This whole story is about God giving him and his wife Sarah a family, but 2 different times. He basically gives Sarah away to other men by denying that she's even his wife. And then Sarah gets impatient about having a son, and so she makes Abraham sleep with her servant girl, which then causes all of these other problems in the family.
So they get really old, and you begin to think that there's no way they're going to have a kid of their own. But then, miraculously, they do. It's Isaac.
And Isaac, he has 2 sons, Esau and Jacob, and it seems like things are going pretty good.
But Jacob, the younger brother, wants the family's inheritance, which belongs to Esau, the older brother. So he devises a plan where he's going to steal it from his father, Isaac, who, at this point in the story, is now old and blind.
Which who does that? Horrible, stealing from your blind father.
Yeah, and then he just takes off.
So Jacob goes on from there to have 12 sons, big family. But Jacob loves his 11th son, Joseph, way more than all the others. And so he gives him the special Technicolor dream coat, and his brothers, because of this, come to hate him.
So much so that they plan on killing him.
But they don't. They instead just sell him as a slave down in Egypt.
Now, while in Egypt, through this crazy series of events, Joseph goes from being in a prison cell to becoming the second in command there.
And so later on, the whole Middle East falls into this food shortage. And Joseph's brothers, they come down to Egypt looking for food. And then when they get there, who should they find as the ruler of the whole land?
It's Joseph, that guy they sold into slavery. But he actually saves them from starving to death.
And so here you have it. These are the great-grandchildren of Abraham who have done this heinous act to their brother. But God has transformed their evil into something good.
And that's exactly what Joseph says here in the last paragraph of the entire book. He says, you guys planned all of this for evil, but God planned it for good, to save people's lives.
Now these words, they conclude the book because they actually summarize the message of the whole story so far. Humans keep choosing evil, and we are thinking they're screwing up God's plan, but he keeps turning their evil back into good. And somehow, he's going to use this family to restore humanity back to the garden.
So that's the book of Genesis. But we still don't know how exactly he's going to use this family to bring us back to the garden.
Well, yeah, but this is just the first book, so that's what the rest of the Bible sets out to answer.
You've planned this for evil, but God has planned it to do good. The story of the Bible. And the story of, especially, the Old Testament as we see God at work in this family. We're going to look at some of these glimpses. You know, it's interesting. I've learned these stories since I was a kid, and like I've said over and over again as we've kind of retold these stories recently, they don't always look like I remember them. And I'll tell you what, we're going to get into the story of Jacob and Esau, and it's a rough one. But today we're going to start with first Abraham. Now, Abraham's a huge character. In fact, the story of Abraham is from Genesis chapter 12 through Genesis chapter 21. Somebody this morning before church said, okay, I found Genesis 12, but I don't see a verse 21. And I'm like, oh no, it's chapters all the way through 21. It's a huge story because Abraham is a huge character. All throughout the New Testament, you see the talk of being sons of Abraham, children of Abraham. I grew up singing a song called Father Abraham Had Many Sons. Anybody grow up singing this song? And we're moving our arms and kicking and spinning around and doing all this crazy stuff, and I couldn't figure out what it was even about when I was a kid. But Abraham's a big deal. And it's because out of Abraham, God is doing his redemptive work in the world. And actually it starts before that. The chapter before this, in chapter 11, we see the genealogy where we go from Noah to his son Shem, who he blessed because of his covering of him. Shem then goes down as ultimately his descendant is Abram. So we're continuing from the line of Noah and Shem to Abram, which is going to lead to Isaac and Jacob, and to the 12 tribes of Israel, out of who ultimately, eventually, comes the Son of God, Jesus. So I want to look at three things. We're going to look at a condensed version of Abraham because it is way too long and way too much. And I would encourage you to go back and read it because it's an interesting story. It's detailed, and you get a chance to see a man who is called and faithful and yet sometimes faithless and human, which to me gives me great hope that if God is at work in Abraham, if God is faithful to Abraham and Abraham doesn't quite get it right all the time, maybe God will continue to be faithful to me too. But let's look at three moments. The first one, God calls him. For some reason, God saw Abram and chose him to be the father of the nations. It says in Genesis chapter 12, starting in verse 1, the Lord had said to Abram, go from your country, your people and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Can you imagine that kind of pressure? You're going to be my guy, and I want you to go to this new place, and anybody who blesses you, I'm going to bless. If anybody curses you, I'm going to curse. And through you, I'm going to save the whole world. It seems heavy to me. And yet Abram's response was to go. He took his wife, he took his nephew, he took all of his stuff, and he uprooted his life, and he took off for a place he wasn't sure about. This is a beginning point of faith for Abram. He is a man who, when God calls, is willing to go. A year and a half ago, a little more than that, Katie and I, we'd been in ministry in Iowa for 10 years, and we got an email from a church in Gardner, Kansas, and I had never heard of Gardner, Kansas. Should I say that out loud? And so we started to talk through this process. And I remember I was having a conversation with my dad, who's a pastor, and we had a tendency to move quite often when I was a kid. My dad would be in a church and see growth and health and those things, and then be called to somewhere new. And as a kid, it was always this clear call from God that, like, God beamed some light, and Dad knew that it was time to move on to a new place. So I called my dad and I said, Dad, we're happy where we are. Ministry is good. Things are fine. Our family's good. Everything's great. We've got this contact from this place. How do I know if it's God calling? And he's like, yeah, you don't. I'm like, what? All this time, I was sure that every time we moved, God called you, and it was clear. And he said, well, yeah, he did. I know that now, looking back. But at the time, we never really were sure. We prayed, we talked about it, we tried to understand what was best for us, but we didn't always know for sure what we were doing. So we took a chance and we went. See that with Abram. He's called out, he takes everything and he goes. And he uproots his whole life. But much like me, and much like probably you, he also isn't 100% sure God is going to cover all this. So one of the first places they go is Egypt, and he gets to Egypt and he's afraid because his wife is beautiful, and he's afraid that the Pharaoh and the people in Egypt are going to want his wife and therefore kill him. And so he tells her to let everybody know that you're my sister, not my wife. So basically Pharaoh takes him in to his own home to be his wife. When he does that, God does what he promised, which is somebody messes with you, I'm going to mess with them. And he starts afflicting Pharaoh and his family with all these problems until even Pharaoh recognizes that something is wrong. And he goes back to Abram and says, why did you lie to me? He gives him his wife back and says, go and get out of here. Leave us alone. And I think of that moment where it's like Abram gets up and goes, this wonderful faith moment of getting up and following where God says, but then the first chance he gets, he's not quite sure God's going to cover everything. Not quite sure God's going to take care of me. I'm worried because my wife is beautiful. Somebody might kill me because they want her. So we're going to have to come up with our own little scheme to make sure that we're all okay. I sometimes catch myself doing that too. Scheming, planning, thinking I better do God's work for him to make sure that things are covered. And yet, God was faithful, right? Abram sinned. He gave his wife away. He lied about his situation, and yet God worked it out for him. He afflicted the Pharaoh. He caused him to return Abram's wife and allowed them to continue on their way. God's faithfulness led him out. The second moment in Genesis 15 is the moment of covenant, where God says to him, here's the promise I'm going to give you. He says this, after this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I'm your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him, This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and he said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. So shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, and into the lands of those around. God makes a covenant with Abram and a promise and says, Your wife has been barren all this time, but I've got plans. Don't worry about your heir because he's going to be your son. God promises, and what happens next? Abraham chooses, instead of full faith in God's plan, his wife gets impatient. And Sarah says, Why don't you take Hagar? Why don't you take my servant? And you'll have a child with her. She will serve as the intermediary to bring you a child as God has promised. And that way, we'll have the kids that the covenant says we'll have. And once again, Abraham does it. Their response was impatience. And you know what? It just caused all sorts of trouble. You know, when we respond with impatience, when we respond with disobedience, my experience is it usually brings trouble. And it did. Sarah and Hagar started having trouble. Sarah was mistreating her and treating her poorly. And, you know, things just got bad. And in fact, it got worse as their people grew. They waited impatiently instead of letting God be faithful to them. I've done that too. Waited impatiently, hoping that I could figure out what needs to happen next. But once again, God was faithful. They were 100 years old. They weren't supposed to be having kids anymore. And yet God brought them Isaac. So we see Abram was called. He listened, but wasn't quite all in yet, but God was faithful. God told him the promise that he would have children, and Abraham believed, but he also got impatient and so went his own way, and even though that caused trouble, God was faithful and gave him a son. And then, finally, a test. I told this story to the kids. After promise after promise after promise that God will make Abraham into a great nation, he finally gives him his son, and he finally has the thing that God has promised, and then God says, okay, here's what I need you to do. Go up on a mountain and sacrifice your son to me. Can you imagine? I remember seeing the Bible miniseries a few years ago that came out and that went through some of these stories. And I remember he looked mentally ill when you started to see Abraham's conversations with God and his plans to take his son and sacrifice him. It's a horrible thing to ask. Something I can't imagine being faithful to with my 3 sons. And I didn't even have to wait till I was 100 to have them. And yet Abraham, at this point, we see grow. Abraham takes his son, takes him up on a mountain, and prepares to sacrifice him. and in fact is ready to do it until God stops him and provides for him another. We see this arc of Abraham. You know, he's faithful, he's not faithful. He's faithful, he's impatient. He's faithful, and he's faithful. We see growth in him where he goes from one who, like us, struggles to listen and to do what God asked him to do, to the point where his obedience is so great, his trust in God is so solid, that he's even willing to take his only heir up on a mountain and offer him to God. This shows us a God who is faithful. Because only a God who is faithful can lead to a man who has faith, like Abraham. This morning, as we look at this story, I want to encourage you to go back and read it and see what happens in the life of Abraham as he grows into this man willing to give up his own son back to God. He messes up so many times, but God's faithfulness brings him to a place that he can trust. Now, my hope is that we can experience that too. That God's faithfulness to us will lead us to a place where we can trust him so well that even when we're not sure how it's going to work, we know that he will come through. Because God is choosing us and calling us. He is asking us to obey even when we think we know better. He's inviting us to trust so that he can do great things in us.